Hello everyone. This week is class 10, and after our brief hiatus last week, we're going to continue here with a little bit more about materials. So what we'll do today, it says Clash Lecture TBA because I haven't posted that yet. But we will start, when we get together at noon today, we'll start by just doing a quick review of the interior design screenshots that you found from video games related to the BBC television series that I had you watch from last week to this week, which was quite lengthy, which actually brings me to our assignment for next week. We're not going to have any for next week. So I had you power through 3.5 hours of videos, so I think we can take a little bit of a break, although we should be excited to be working in Unreal anyway. But the point, though, hopefully you enjoyed that series from BBC. Maybe you didn't. But the point is, as we learned from, I believe we've looked at least one lecture from the prior GDC that talks about how interior design those concepts are very important to understand as a level designer. So really the whole point of that was to get you watching one, make the connection. Maybe that particular series was not for you, but if you want to be a level designer, I would highly encourage you to find some of these, I guess you would call them home and garden shows that you do enjoy, because you can learn a lot from them, both interior and exterior. So, that's something that you want to start to think about if you want to be a level designer. Also today we'll cover a few more of the principles of design here when we meet at noon. And the thing that I want to cover in this technical lecture here is just working with subsurface scattering. There's really two ways we can do subsurface. There's a subsurface scattering shading model, and then there's one called subsurface profile. I'm going to show you the first one here, subsurface scattering. It doesn't give us as much control. Really, the second method is the better one, which is the one I go with for everything. But I thought I'd cover both since they're there. And actually, in some of the newer versions of Unreal, 4.25 has it, but I think 4.26, which is coming out soon, it's in preview right now, also has some additional skin tools actually. So subsurface scattering can be a lot of things. It's basically the light going into the surface of an object, scattering around and being bounced back out. So we see this on a lot of things that are semi-translucent or semi-transparent. I should say semi-transparent or translucent, such as liquids, orange juice, milk. We have wax, like a candle, will have subsurface scattering. But more times than not, we think of it in terms of skin, human skin. So they've added some additional tools for that, but these are the fundamental tools. So that's what I want to cover in the lecture here today. I've also given us a reference to the subsurface profile process here. So you can use that as an additional resource. So let me jump over to Unreal and we'll take a look at these. Now, what I did here is I gave you access to a file. This is actually a ZBrush project I had done many, many years ago. Probably more than 10. So I'm going to use this as my example piece, because actually to see subsurface scattering, it's kind of difficult when you just have a smooth surface like a sphere. Subsurface you can see better when you have not only a varied surface that's been modeled, the actual surface relief is there, but then also normal maps can play into this and bump maps. So, it's because it's a subtle effect. And actually one of the main things I want to show today is how you can dial in the effect before you apply it to your entire scene, because it's such a subtle effect that sometimes you can't tell when you're visually inundated with everything in your scene. So I want to go through that process. So I have this downloaded, and you can download it as well and play with it if you'd like. So I'll move that aside, and I'm here in Unreal. Now, the other thing that I like to do when I'm trying to dial in my subsurface is I just create a map that's empty. So I could do that here. I'll just go File, New Level, and I'm going to make an empty level, completely empty level. And I'm not going to, no, I'll save those selections. Okay, so completely empty level here. I'll even make it unlit until I get some lights in here. So I'm going to put down a plane. And I'm just going to zero that plane out over here in the details panel. So we'll go 0, 0, 0. And we'll zoom in on it. I guess I'll just hit the F key to zoom in. And then I'm going to create a light. So I'm just going to put a point light into the scene. And now that I have a light in there, I can go back into lit mode. Well, that's interesting. How come my lighting is not... Or if maybe my light just happens to be too large. That's probably what it is. Actually, let me make... well, maybe I should import my pumpkin and see how large that is. So let me go ahead and do that. So I'm going to do import to game. I'm just right-clicking and doing import to game. And I have it right here. Here's the pumpkin FBX. So this, when you unzip that folder, this is what you'll have. So you'll have a diffuse and normal for the body of the pumpkin and a diffuse and normal for the stem. So I'm going to bring in the pumpkin first. I don't need to change anything in my import options. These are all okay, so I'll just say import all. And I got just some smoothing group warnings here, which shouldn't matter too much. So there's my two objects. Now they come in as separate objects. If I want to put them in the scene together, I can just shift click on both of them, then drop them in the scene. Oh, and I can see what's happening here. The plane is way too small. So now that I put that in, I get a sense of scale. So let's make that plane much larger, like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my light, because we want to think of the way subsurface scattering works is that the light needs to enter from one direction, it gets scattered around and comes back out. Now some of it will bounce back in the direction of the light source over here, but other parts of the light energy will permeate the surface and come out maybe all the way in the back or out of the side. So to really dial in subsurface scattering, what I like to do is just take about this angle here where my light creates this hard edge, because now I'll be able to see what's permeating the surface and bouncing out and what's bouncing directly back towards the direction of the light. So this is the setup that I use. All right, so let's, and actually I could, before I even import the texture maps, we could take a look at both of these subsurface examples without adding the texture maps yet. So I'm going to just create, to do the first one, which is just straight subsurface scattering, I'm just going to right click in here and create a new material. And I'll call this one just SSS for subsurface scattering. And then I'll double click on it. And that's off screen here. So let me get this in screen. It's way too large. There we go. All right, so here's my material. So if I select it, I can come over here to the details panel, and under shading model, I can change this to subsurface. So here's the other one. This is a newer one, pre-integrated skin. That one's predominantly for skin. So we have subsurface and we have subsurface profile. This is the second one we're going to look at. This one actually gives us more control. So I'm going to go with subsurface first. So I'll choose subsurface. Now, with subsurface, we really only have one control here, and that is opacity. Opacity just determines the intensity of the scattering effect. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a color. So I'll do a constant 3 vector. I'm going to put a color into the base color here. And I'll make that color, we know that we're making a pumpkin, so I'm going to make it like an orangey color here, like that. And now when I make it orange, you can see that it's not very orange there. And that's because we have it set to subsurface. Now, opacity determines the subsurface, so I might want to, at the very least, place a constant in here so I have some control over that opacity. So I have 0 or 1. And I don't really see much of a difference there. And that's why working with a sphere to dial in your subsurface is not going to help much. But let's see what this looks like when we put it onto the pumpkin. So I'll just save it. And then I'm going to move it aside for a second. and I'll come out here and grab just the pumpkin base, and I'm going to apply that new material to it. Oops, that's not the material. There it is. There's the material. All right, and not much has changed actually. So the other thing with this particular material as well is that whenever we make a change in here, we have to save it so that it's applied. Otherwise, it's not automatic in the scene, whereas the subsurface profile is. So let's see if we can dial this in a little more. Let's bring this down to 0.5, and I'm going to take a look at my base color here. Let's see if I lower this down. Just to try to get it a little more orange. Okay, I paused for a second because I was just tinkering with this a little more. Subsurface is so difficult to dial in, but I had done an example myself last night, and I swear I got a little more of the orange to show here, but I can't seem to do that. So again, I have a value of 1 in opacity. Oh, sorry, I had this off screen. I have a value of 1 in opacity, and that should give me a more focused scatter. Now I'm going to look at it from the front. You can see some of the orange coming out, but it's still primarily white. And again, the problem with this particular shader is that we don't have a lot of control over it. Let's just compare it though to no subsurface at all. So what I'm going to do is just take the pumpkin. Actually, I'll just take the pumpkin. I don't need the stem. And I'm going to duplicate that. So I'm just alt dragging out a duplicate. So we have them kind of next to each other. And on this second one, I'm going to make a material that's just plain. Well, actually, I have one here. The default material that this came in with is called pumpkin. The material I made with the subsurface scattering is called subsurface scattering. So let's just double check this material. So I'll open it up here. And this one just simply has a constant piped into base color, and it is set to opaque, default lit. Okay, so that should be a material with no subsurface. So let's put that one onto this pumpkin. And now you can see the difference now. So you see how this one, even in the crevices, we've lost detail, so the light isn't permeating. Actually, if I just go ahead and drop the subsurface material onto it, you can see the difference here. See, now you can see the subsurface there. But again, this particular shading model is difficult to control, primarily because we don't have the ability to determine what that subsurface scatter color is. So I don't use this one. So I'm not going to spend a lot more time on it, this one. I'm going to jump right to the subsurface profile instead. So I'm going to use the same material. I'll just reorganize it. So when I select the material node itself, I come down here, and instead of subsurface, I'm going to choose subsurface profile. Subsurface profile. And you can see immediately we get a different result entirely. Now, opacity still functions as the strength of or intensity of the subsurface, but we'll have more parameters that we're going to get from this asset. It's called a subsurface profile. So we actually need to create another asset in the content browser that we will bring into the material itself, and it's called a subsurface profile. So let me put this aside for a second. And out here, I'm going to right click. And this is in the materials and textures category. And unfortunately, it's cut off down here. It's cut off to the point where it's actually under my recording window too. So I have to move that out of the way. Okay, let me try that again. Okay, so materials and textures, and it's being cut off, but it's called subsurface profile down here. So there's my subsurface profile. So I'll just name it SSS profile. Now that needs to be put into the subsurface material. If I double click on it, it's just a series of parameters here. Now there's some new stuff here that I haven't worked with much yet, like the Burley normalized and the transmission and dual specular. The primary controls to get this dialed in will be right here. Scatter radius, subsurface color, and fall off color. Those will be the main ones. And the great thing about these is these update on the fly. We don't have to hit save and apply. So that's another advantage of using this method. So let me come back to my, let me remove the pumpkin material for now, just to get that out of the way. So back in my subsurface material, this is the original one, but I've changed its shading model to subsurface profile. So I'm going to bring that subsurface profile in. So I just will need to drag it and drop it here. Or you could just grab it from the drop list because it's the only one down there. It's being cut off. It's right here. There's subsurface profile. So it's bringing that in. So now I'll go ahead and hit save. And now you can see even here, I get a much better, excuse me, a much better look. Let's see. Oh, I guess I'm gonna pull this one for now. Let's just come back to this one. So this one has that material on it. Now, the first thing I could do is I could adjust the opacity here. Now, because this is part of the material, when I do adjust the opacity for intensity, I do have to hit apply or save in order for it to work. But when I start adjusting the subsurface profile, I don't have to. But let's just see what this looks like if I bring my opacity, I'm just going to slide this off screen a little bit here, back down to 0. And then I'll hit apply. And you'll see it got rid of all the subsurface. Whereas a value of 1, it'll start to spread through that surface again. Just a little bit. Now, let's take a look at the subsurface profile, though. So the subsurface profile, the first thing we want to take a look at is the, let me see if I can just adjust this so I can get all this on screen here. Let's take a look at the subsurface radius. So this is how far into the surface it will scatter. So now you can see how this updates on the fly. There's a deep, I've got like a 21 unit radius, and see how it's really makes the pumpkin look almost transparent, or very translucent, I should say. But if I dial that back, it pulls it out. And if I go to 0 or 0.1, I have no subsurface. I mean, the value is so little, it's not scattering anything. So you can already see the advantage of using this system because we can do it on the fly. All right, so I'm going to add a lot of subsurface here so that I can see it. And now I want to take a look at subsurface color and fall off color. So we can see right now it looks like it's pushing sort of an orange through there. But let's see what happens if we change the subsurface color. So I'm going to change it to something really extreme like blue. And then I'll just dial this in and out. So this is actually how I dial it in. I choose my colors, or I choose a really crazy color sometimes just to see what it's going to do, and then I just adjust the scatter radius. Now the blue doesn't seem to be pushing through very well. So actually the other thing that I like to do is if I'm trying to determine subsurface versus fall off color, I'll make one of these neutral. Like the subsurface color I made completely neutral. So now it's really, what it's doing is it's pushing the surface color through. But the reason I got a really odd result here before is because if I made it blue, I was multiplying the blue by the orange. So it's tricky. But let's just see if we can figure out what fall off color does. So I set this one to a neutral color so that I don't get any confusing interaction here. And then I'll take the fall off color and let's set that, let's change that around and see what we get. Okay, so now we can see now this is controlling the color that's coming through the surface. So now if I wanted to have a greenish cast, we can see what that's doing. That's giving me a greenish cast there. So that's interesting. So it looks like my fall off color is controlled by the subsurface color we're seeing is actually controlled by the fall off color. I'm going to leave it a green, just so we know that that's where that's coming from. Now I'm going to come back to the subsurface color. And actually, the one thing I want to point out here is that the subsurface color doesn't really do much with color. It doesn't matter what color I make. I mean, it'll make it more intense to some degree, but really what this is this is a weight. So it's really more dependent on its value from light to dark, more so than what it is what the actual color value is. So many times I just leave this as a neutral color, and then I just use the values of light to dark to dial in more of that subsurface scattering. So a lighter value gives you more subsurface, and a darker value gives you less. See, if I go all the way down here, I have almost no subsurface. Now I could introduce some color to it, and that's going to multiply on top. You can see it gets greener here. Or since my fall off color is green, if I add red, I'm going to get, the in-between here, which would be somewhere in here. So there's so much tweaking that will go into this. What I want to do is just try to give you the fundamentals of how to try to dial this in and what these values are actually doing, because I think the names to some degree are a little bit misleading. So again, subsurface color is really more so the intensity or the weight of the subsurface, and then the fall off color, that's where you can actually control what color is shining through. And then our over here, our opacity still is sort of like an overall multiplier. So again, if I set it to 0, now because this is not in the subsurface profile, I have to hit apply, I get no subsurface. So typically when I'm dialing in my subsurface, I put the opacity at 1 so that I have the full multiplier in there. I imagine I could even overdrive that. Let's see what happens when I overdrive it. Does that increase it even more? Not really. It's really just a 0 to 1 value. And then I come over here to the subsurface profile, increase this radius until I can see a really significant scatter. And then I will dial in the fall off color that I want and the subsurface color. So let me just hook up all the pumpkin's textures and see how that affects it as well. So I'm going to import those. So I'll just right click in here and do import to game. And I'm going to bring in, I'm not going to do the stem, I'm just going to do the body. The stem might have some scattering, but not a lot. So I'll grab the diffuse and the normal. And then I'm going to put that diffuse and normal in here. This is the material. So I'll drag them in to get 2 texture samples. And then I'm going to hook these up. So I'll go put this into base color instead of this. And I'll put this into my normal. And let's hit apply and see what happens. And now we get something that looks even more realistic because I'm adding some variable texture here for color, and I'm also adding the normal map, which adds more variation to the surface. So again, I would also like to compare that to what the pumpkin would look like without any subsurface. So let me save these here. And I'll close that for a second. And I'm going to take my subsurface material and duplicate it, but then turn it back into a non-subsurface material. So I'll right click on it and just do duplicate. And I'm going to call this non-SSS for subsurface scattering. And then I'll jump into that new material. And I'm going to change its shading profile here on the material node itself back to default lit. So now we'll have no subsurface in there. And you'll notice the subsurface profile has grayed out. I mean, it's still listed there, but it's grayed out. I mean, if I could, I should be able to just, I guess I can't remove it unless I had turned it back on, but that's okay. All right, so let's hit apply. And now I'm going to make, again, I'll do another duplicate of this pumpkin. Right there. I might want to bring the light over a little bit so that we get kind of the even weight on both of these. Okay. And now on this one, I'm going to apply the non-subsurface material. And you can see the difference between those two. See how we're getting light in the crevices, and that's the subsurface. Now this subsurface is probably too intense. I'm probably going to want to go back to the subsurface profile here. Let's see, can we see? Ooh, it's almost being cut off. Let's do this. So I can bring it in a little more. Okay, so now I'm going to bring, I'll pull that scatter radius down to something more normal. Like I have it around 4 now. And you can still see the difference here. And you can see why it's important to try to dial in subsurface in like an empty scene with really harsh lighting, because the difference there is so subtle. However, when it comes to things like close-ups of characters' faces and skin, or milk or candle, when we're doing close-ups of those things, these attributes can make all the difference in the world if you're going for photorealism. So again, you see the difference. If I come back to the front, which is really hard to dial that in if we're looking straight on, now you can see the difference between those two. This one feels more realistic. I actually might have still a little too much subsurface on it, but you get the idea. So that's a quick rundown of working with subsurface scattering. And again, it's a subtle effect. So it's something that you're going to use when you really are looking for photorealism and believability for assets that are up close. You know, from a distance, well, even at a distance, we still can see a fair difference between the two. Yeah. So I think those are the only technical concepts I wanted to cover here today. And again, if you want more information on the subsurface profile, which is that second method I used, I added a link here to the Unreal documents. So I think I'll stop it there. Again, we don't have any assignment for next week. And when we meet at noon today, we'll take a quick look at our interior design screenshots from various video games, and then we'll go over some more principles of design. So I'll see everybody at noon.